When my wife Laura started going out more often in the evenings, I didn't think much of it at first. I've always been the stay-at-home type, happy with a quiet evening in, but Laura's always been more social, more outgoing. She started saying things like, "I need some me time, Greg," and "you'd be bored if you came." So, I didn't question it. But then it started happening more frequently. Tuesday, Thursday, even on our usual Friday night dinners, she'd be dressed to the nines, with makeup in a style that seemed out of place. That's when she started talking about the local bar near our house, a place we used to go to together years ago. She'd go on about how it had been revamped and how it was a great place to unwind, almost like she was trying to sell me on the idea of her going alone. Then one night, she didn't come home until close to midnight, more cheerful than I'd seen her in years, saying she'd been catching up with an old friend. But when I asked who, she just brushed me off, calling it a quiet night. I felt a pit in my stomach, but I kept quiet. A week later, I was out in the yard when a young girl came up to me. She looked nervous, her eyes darting everywhere but at me, until she finally said, "Mr. Gregg, I need to talk to you about your wife." Right there, I felt something break. She told me she was the bartender's daughter. I couldn't shake the words out of my mind. Emily, the bartender's daughter, standing there in my yard, telling me something no husband ever wants to hear. I know this isn't really my business, Mr. Gregg, but I thought you should know," she'd said. She looked down, her hands twisting nervously, as if she were deciding whether she'd made a mistake by coming over in the first place. "Go on," I urged, even though I could feel a heavy knot forming in my gut. I had a feeling I already knew where this was headed, but some part of me still hoped it wasn't true. I wasn't ready for her answer, but I was too far in to turn back now. Emily took a deep breath and looked me in the eye, pity etched across her face. "Your wife's been coming to the bar a lot lately, and she's been leaving late. With my dad." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to tell my mom. I just thought you should know. I thought it was strange, but then when I saw it happening again and again." She trailed off, shifting from one foot to the other, looking relieved but also uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, as if that would somehow soften the blow. "I didn't mean to upset you or anything. I couldn't keep it to myself." For a moment, all I could do was stand there, holding the garden hose like an anchor in my hand, trying to process what she was saying. My mind scrambled to find excuses, explanations, anything that would make this situation into something other than what it seemed. Maybe Laura was just having a few harmless drinks. Maybe she'd stayed too late because of work, an old friend, a chance meeting. The excuses were piling up in my mind, and each one felt emptier than the last. I nodded, thanked her for telling me, and watched her hurry away. She glanced back once, as if to make sure I wasn't mad at her for bringing this to my attention. But I wasn't angry with her. No, Emily had done me a favor, though it didn't feel like one at the time. She'd given me the truth, or at least a piece of it. Now I had to decide what to do with it. When I walked back inside, Laura was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables for dinner. She didn't look up when I entered, just kept working, completely unaware of the tidal wave that had just hit me outside. She looked so normal, so calm. She laughed about something she'd seen on her phone and glanced at me with a smile, like everything was just fine. I wanted to confront her right then and there. I wanted to ask her what exactly she was doing at the bar, night after night, with the bartender. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was a desire to hold on to the shred of normalcy we had left. So instead, I sat down at the kitchen table and forced myself to act casual, even though my mind was racing a mile a minute. "How was your day?" she asked, sliding a plate of food in front of me. "Fine," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "And yours?" She shrugged. "Oh, busy. Work was insane. I'm thinking of heading out to grab a drink later, actually just to unwind." She said it so nonchalantly, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. But now, every word felt like a lie. I watched her as she took her seat across from me, barely noticing the food on her plate. Her hair was done, her makeup just a bit more noticeable than usual, and she was wearing a new blouse I hadn't seen before. It was subtle, the way she'd started dressing up more for these nights out, but now that I was looking, I couldn't ignore it. "Meeting up with anyone?" I asked casually, trying to keep my tone light, even though I already knew the answer. She shook her head, barely looking up. No, just me, she said, her voice a little too breezy. Sometimes it's nice to just have a drink alone, you know? I nodded, not wanting to push her too far. But inside, I could feel that small knot of suspicion from earlier tightening. This wasn't like her. Laura had always been the social one, yes, but she'd never been secretive about it. We'd been married long enough that I thought I knew everything about her. But now, it was like I was living with a stranger. The days that followed were tense, to say the least. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before, small details that now seemed glaringly obvious. Like how she'd begun keeping her phone close at all times, even setting it face down on the table during dinner. Or how she'd get text messages late at night, only to silence her phone and claim it was work stuff. And the more I watched, the more I noticed. Then there were the excuses. It started with her saying she needed to unwind, but soon she was going out 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. Just a quick drink, she'd say, brushing it off as if it were nothing. But the nights grew later, and the drinks didn't seem so quick anymore. She'd come home, flushed and cheerful, but she'd barely look me in the eye. One night, I decided to stay up late to see what time she'd come home. I sat in the dark, watching the clock tick away, trying not to let my mind wander too far into the unknown. Midnight came and went, and still, she wasn't back. I tried to tell myself she'd just lost track of time. But when I finally heard her key in the lock around 1 in the morning, the relief I felt was quickly overshadowed by a surge of anger. "Late night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as she stepped through the door. She looked startled, as if she hadn't expected me to be awake. "Oh, Greg, I didn't know you were still up," she said, laughing nervously. "I just ran into an old friend. We got to talking, and, well, you know how it is." I nodded, though the words tasted bitter on my tongue. "Sure, I know how it is." But I didn't know. Not anymore. The woman standing in front of me felt like a stranger. Gone was the Laura who used to laugh with me over dinner, who used to snuggle up on the couch for an old movie, who used to look at me like I was the only person in the world. Now, she barely looked at me at all. After she went to bed that night, I sat up for hours, trying to piece together the fragments of our life that suddenly felt so fragile. Emily's words echoed in my mind, her worried face flashing before me as she told me about Laura's late nights at the bar. And now I couldn't shake the feeling that my wife, the woman I'd trusted with everything, was hiding something from me. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that maybe she just needed some space, that maybe I was overthinking things. But the doubt was there, lurking in the back of my mind, growing with every passing day. One Saturday, Laura said she'd be out for most of the evening, catching up with friends. I nodded, trying to act casual, but something inside me snapped. After she left, I grabbed my coat and decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I went to the bar myself. It was almost empty when I arrived, just a few regulars nursing their drinks at the counter. The bartender glanced up, his expression changing slightly when he saw me. I wondered if he knew who I was. I wondered if he knew I was Laura's husband. I sat at a small table in the corner, trying to blend in as best I could. Minutes passed, then an hour. And just when I was about to give up, I saw her. Laura walked in, smiling and laughing, her hand brushing the bartender's arm as she leaned in close. They stood at the bar, talking in hushed tones, her laughter echoing in the dim light. My heart sank as I watched them. It wasn't just friendly banter. There was a familiarity, an intimacy in the way they stood together, in the way she looked at him, like she used to look at me. I couldn't watch any longer. I left the bar and drove home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The truth was finally out, and there was no denying it now. Laura wasn't just going out for me time. She was slipping away from me, piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it, or if I even wanted to. That night, I lay awake, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I'd spent years trusting this woman, believing in her, building a life with her. And now, it felt like everything we'd shared was slipping through my fingers. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not without a fight. That night changed everything. I couldn't look at Laura the same way. She was still smiling, laughing, going about her days, coming home late, acting like nothing was wrong. But for me, the mask had slipped. Every look, every gesture felt hollow, forced, as if she were just going through the motions. But I knew I couldn't just confront her without proof. If I brought it up now, she'd twist it, laugh it off, or find some way to make me the fool. And so, I waited. I observed. I became a silent detective in my own marriage, noticing the small details, piecing together the puzzle I never thought I'd have to solve. The first step was her phone. Laura had started carrying it everywhere, like a lifeline she couldn't afford to lose. She put it face down on the table, always within arm's reach, and when a message came through, she'd glance over, clear the notification, and shove it back in her bag. It was the way a teenager would guard their secrets, and it only made my suspicions grow. One evening, after she drifted off to sleep, I took a risk. Her phone was resting on the nightstand, so I waited until I was sure she was out, then I picked it up, heart pounding. I unlocked it using her usual passcode, hoping she hadn't changed it. She hadn't. Relief flooded through me for a brief moment. But as I scrolled, my chest tightened. Messages, hundreds of them, all under a name I didn't recognize, Sammy's Bar. It seemed innocent enough, like maybe it was an automated update for specials at her favorite spot. But as I scrolled, I saw that Sammy's Bar was far from just a bar contact. The messages were everything from lighthearted texts, full of inside jokes, to late-night messages filled with things I didn't want to believe she was saying to another man. But what caught my eye most were the deleted photos. Only fragments remained, like pieces of a broken mirror. One was a selfie of her at the bar, another of her holding a drink. And then, there it was, a shot of her hand brushing against his on the bar counter, a closeness that cut deep. I locked her phone and slipped it back onto the nightstand, my mind reeling. The evidence was there, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't undeniable. Not yet. If I confronted her now, she'd come up with a dozen excuses. I needed something she couldn't wiggle her way out of. The next day, I went by the bar during my lunch break. It was nearly empty, just a few customers nursing coffee and drinks in the early afternoon. I sat at a booth in the corner, ordered a drink, and waited for the bartender, Laura's bartender, to notice me. When he did, he looked surprised, almost uncomfortable. "Hey there, anything else you'd like?" he asked, too casually, a nervous edge in his voice. I looked him dead in the eye, the weight of the truth settling into every word I was about to say. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you man to man," I replied, my voice low but steady. "I think you know my wife, Laura." His face went pale, and for a second, he didn't respond. He glanced down, fiddling with a rag in his hands, then finally muttered, "Yeah, I know her. She comes in here sometimes." "Sometimes," I repeated, holding his gaze. "Look, I know what's going on. I don't want to play games. You're a married man, right?" He flinched slightly, looking down at his ring, as if he'd forgotten it was still there. "Yes, I am. Look, I didn't mean for this to get complicated. Laura, she was the one who—" I cut him off, not wanting to hear him blame her. I wasn't here for his excuses. I was here for the truth. "So it's true. You've been seeing her behind my back." He nodded, looking ashamed, but there was a defiance in his eyes too, as if he were daring me to make a scene. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "Tell me everything," I demanded. "I don't need details. Just tell me how long this has been going on." He swallowed hard, rubbing his temples. "A few months. I don't know exactly. She comes in, says she needs a break from home, and, well, I didn't push her away. Do you realize what you've done?" I said, my voice low and cold. "Not just to me, but to your own family?" He didn't answer, just looked away, shame flickering in his eyes. Part of me wanted to hit him, to make him feel the pain he'd brought into my life. But instead, I stood up, pushed my drink aside, and left without another word. I was back in the car, sitting in silence, letting it sink in. All the years Laura and I had spent together, the plans we'd made, the trust I'd put in her, it was all tainted now. I felt like I'd been thrown into some twisted game where the rules had changed without warning. But one thing was clear. I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. When I got home, Laura was there, looking as calm as ever, flipping through a magazine like she didn't have a care in the world. I watched her, wondering how she could sit there, knowing what she'd done, lying through her teeth every time she left for the bar. I waited until she looked up, feigning surprise at my early return. "Hey, you're home early," she said with a small smile, but I didn't return it. "We need to talk, Laura," I said, my tone cold and clipped. The smile faded from her face, replaced by a look of confusion, or maybe guilt. It was hard to tell these days. "Is something wrong?" she asked, putting down the magazine, her gaze cautious, guarded. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I went by the bar today," I said, watching her closely for a reaction. "I had a little chat with the bartender." Her eyes widened, and she quickly looked down, as if searching for something to say. "Greg, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "I know what's going on, Laura. I've seen the messages. I've talked to him. So, just stop." There was a moment of silence, a tense, unbearable stillness, as she sat there, caught between denial and the truth. Finally, she sighed a bitter, defeated sound. "Fine. Yes. Yes, okay. I've been seeing him. I'm sorry, Greg, but it just happened." "It just happened?" I echoed, feeling a hollow laugh escape me. "No, Laura. Things like this don't just happen. You made choices. Every time you lied, every time you left the house, every time you put yourself in his arms." She flinched, and for a moment, there was a flicker of regret in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something colder, something darker. "What do you expect me to say, Greg?" she snapped. "That I'm sorry? That I'll never do it again? Maybe I don't want to pretend everything's fine anymore. Maybe I don't want to keep living in this boring routine, day after day. Is that all this was to you? A routine?" My voice cracked slightly, betraying the hurt I'd tried to keep buried. "I thought we were building a life together, Laura. I thought we were in this together." She shook her head, sighing with impatience, like I was a child who couldn't understand. "You never get it, Greg. You never did. I needed something more, something exciting. You've never been that." Her words cut deep, sharper than any knife. I felt my chest tighten, the weight of her betrayal crashing down on me all over again. She didn't just betray me. She didn't just lie. She'd thrown everything we'd built together back in my face. And for what? For a fling with a man who couldn't even look me in the eye? In that moment, I realized there was no going back. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice she'd made, again and again, knowing exactly what it would do to me. "I'm done, Laura," I said quietly, the words final and irrevocable. "You can have your excitement. You can have him. But you can't have me." For the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, a realization that maybe she'd pushed too far. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Every room, every piece of furniture, even the quiet spaces we used to share felt tainted. Laura moved through the house as if nothing had changed, throwing me small, half-hearted apologies here and there. But she barely looked at me. If anything, she seemed relieved that I hadn't made a bigger scene, like she'd expected a storm and got off with a drizzle. But I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. I might be quiet, and I might be reserved, but that didn't mean I was just going to sit back and let her destroy everything we'd built without consequence. If she wanted excitement, I'd give her excitement, just not the kind she'd bargained for. I started planning, slowly, methodically, in the dead of night after she'd gone to bed. I'd never imagined myself to be the revenge type, but betrayal has a funny way of changing a man. I thought back to all the time I'd invested in our relationship, all the sacrifices I'd made to build a stable life with her. I wasn't just going to hand her a clean break and a comfortable settlement. No, I'd make sure she felt the consequences of her choices. And I'd make sure everyone else did too. First, I needed to protect myself. The last thing I wanted was for her to take the home we'd bought together or claim any more than her fair share. So I got in touch with my lawyer, an old friend I hadn't seen in years but knew I could trust. I explained the situation to him, sparing no detail, and told him I needed to make sure my interests were safe. He listened quietly, nodded, and promised to help me set everything in motion. The next step was a bit trickier. Laura's affair hadn't stayed a secret, thanks to Emily's brave confession, but most people in our circle still didn't know. I wanted the truth to come out, not in a fit of anger, but carefully and publicly, where she'd have no room to wriggle her way out with lies or excuses. That's when I came up with the idea of the anniversary party. Our close friends and family had grown used to our annual gatherings, a tradition we'd started years ago, one of the few things we'd actually managed to keep going. This year would be no different, at least in their eyes. Invitations were sent out, RSVPs came in, and I quietly prepared for what would become an unforgettable night. Laura was thrilled about the idea of the party. I could see her face light up as we discussed the details. She probably thought I was caving, giving her one last chance to smooth things over, to put up a front that everything was fine. I let her believe that, let her think I was a fool who'd forgiven her, all while I quietly laid the groundwork. On the night of the party, everything was set. Family and friends filled the house, voices mingling in laughter and conversation, glasses clinking, everyone enjoying themselves. Laura was in her element, charming our guests, moving from one group to the next like the gracious hostess she always pretended to be. It would have been almost impressive had I not known the truth about the woman behind that smile. Once everyone had settled, I cleared my throat and called for attention. Laura looked at me, smiling, no doubt expecting a sweet toast, some words of gratitude. But that's not what I had planned. Thank you all for being here tonight. I began, holding my glass steady as I looked out over the crowd. It means a lot to us that you join us for this special occasion. In fact, it's been a year full of surprises. I could feel Laura stiffen beside me, her smile faltering slightly as she watched me, trying to gauge where I was going with this. There's something I want to share with you all, I continued, something important that I've recently discovered. I glanced over at Laura, whose face was now a carefully controlled mask. I've learned this year that marriage is a delicate thing. Trust, loyalty, they're the foundation of everything. And when those things break, there's no going back. A murmur went through the crowd, guests exchanging uncertain glances. Laura's face paled, her smile now gone entirely. I'll cut to the chase, I said, voice steady. Some of you may know Laura has been spending quite a bit of time at the local bar. I just recently found out she's been enjoying more than just the drinks. My eyes bore into hers. Turns out Laura found herself a new friend in the bartender there. A very close friend. There were gasps, a few shocked whispers, and a hand flew to someone's mouth. Laura's cheeks flushed a deep red, and she looked around, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to hide. I thought you all deserved to know, I said, a slight edge to my tone, since you've been part of our lives for so long. And I thought Laura deserved a chance to come clean. I turned to her, giving her the floor. For a second, she just stood there, stunned, unable to meet my gaze. Then, she found her voice, trying to salvage what was left of her reputation. This is ridiculous, she stammered, her voice wavering. Greg, please don't do this. Don't do what? I replied, raising an eyebrow. Don't tell the truth? I'm done hiding it, Laura. I think everyone here deserves to know who you really are. The guests were silent, some staring in shock, others looking away uncomfortably. Laura looked as though she might faint. I took no pleasure in seeing her that way, but she had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. The crowd began to thin out, friends murmuring their goodbyes, offering quick handshakes and pats on the back, a few shooting Laura looks of pity or judgment. She barely spoke a word as the guests left, probably knowing that anything she said would only make things worse. Once the last of our friends and family had gone, I finally turned to her, my heart hammering with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. So, that's it, she spat, her voice filled with a venom I'd never heard before. You couldn't just let it go. Let it go, I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. You really thought I'd just look the other way while you threw our marriage away for a fling? You've got some nerve, Laura. She glared at me, defiance flashing in her eyes. You're no saint, Greg. You think you're perfect, that you're somehow better than everyone else, but you're just as boring and predictable as you've always been. And that was enough for you once. I shot back, the anger finally breaking through. But I guess I was wrong to think that meant anything to you. You wanted excitement, right? Well, congratulations, you got it. She stared at me, breathing heavily, as if the reality of the situation was finally starting to sink in. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, that she might realize the weight of what she'd done. But instead, she just sneered. "Fine," she said, her voice filled with scorn. "If that's how you want it, then we're done." "Good," I replied. "We've been done for a long time." With that, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, the silence of the empty house pressing in around me, the echoes of the night's events still ringing in my ears. It was over. The life we'd built together was shattered, the illusions broken, and there was no going back. I took a deep breath, a strange mixture of relief and sadness settling over me. This wasn't the ending I'd planned for, but maybe it was the one I needed. After Laura stormed out that night, the house felt emptier than it had in years. The echoes of our argument lingered in the walls, reminders of the betrayal and resentment that had festered beneath the surface. For the first few days, I barely slept. I moved from room to room, feeling like a ghost in my own home, haunted by memories of better times that now felt like a lie. But as the days passed, something else crept in, a sense of clarity. I realized I was finally free of her web of lies, her deceit, and the illusion we'd built together. I didn't feel relief, not exactly, but there was a strange peace in knowing the truth, even if it hurt. The friends who'd been at the anniversary party checked in on me over the next few days, offering sympathy, advice, and in one case, an apology for not noticing sooner. They were kind, but every message reminded me of how quickly Laura had fallen from grace in the eyes of our closest friends and family. And then the messages started coming in. First, there was an email, a rambling apology from Laura, filled with phrases like, "I know I hurt you, and I didn't mean for it to go this far." She ended with, "I was wrong, Greg, but I hope you can forgive me for both our sakes." I deleted it without a second thought. I didn't owe her my forgiveness, not after what she'd done. But she didn't stop there. A few days later, a handwritten letter arrived in the mail, and this one was different. It was like she'd poured her heart into every line, every word. She went on about the times we'd spent together, the memories we'd made, and the life we'd built. She reminisced about the early days of our marriage, how we'd fallen in love, how we'd made plans, talked about kids, about dreams we'd left behind. She wrote about the nights we used to spend talking over cups of tea, dreaming of a future that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The letter caught me off guard. For a moment, I felt the old memories tugging at me, memories I'd tried to bury under anger and disappointment. She asked me to give her another chance, promising she would work to regain my trust if I'd let her. "You're the only person who truly knows me, Greg," she wrote. "Please let me make things right." I folded the letter and set it aside, my mind swirling with emotions I couldn't quite pin down. Could we really go back to what we'd had? Was there anything left to salvage? But then I remembered the lies, the nights she'd spent at the bar, the way she'd looked at me without a trace of remorse when I confronted her. Whatever was left between us, it wasn't love. Not anymore. Over the next week, Laura tried calling, even leaving voicemails where her voice cracked with something that might have been genuine regret. But I ignored everyone. I'd learned that remorse often showed up too late. The friends who'd heard about the anniversary party continued reaching out, some of them mentioning that Laura had reached out to them, too, trying to gather sympathy. A few of them expressed uncertainty, wondering if I'd give her another chance. I could tell that some of them thought I might, but they didn't know the full story, not the way I did. They hadn't seen the look on her face when she told me she was done, how quickly she'd thrown everything we'd shared back in my face. After a few more ignored messages, Laura took things a step further. One evening, she showed up at my door unannounced. I was just finishing up dinner when I heard the knock, and when I opened the door, there she was looking worn, as if she hadn't slept in days. She gave me a weak smile, holding up a small bouquet of flowers, as if they could erase everything that had happened. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say no. I wanted to close the door and end it right there, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped aside, and she walked in, looking around the house as if it had somehow changed in the days since she'd left. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, setting the flowers on the table. "About us. About what happened. I know I messed up, Greg. I know that, and I'm not here to make excuses. I want to fix this. I want to try again. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter, feeling a familiar anger bubble up as I looked at her. You want to fix this? I asked, my voice cold. After everything you did? After lying to me, betraying me, and then blaming me for being boring? You really think flowers and a half-hearted apology are going to make this go away? She flinched, guilt flashing in her eyes. No, I don't think it's that simple. I know it's not. But Greg, we've been through so much together. Doesn't that count for anything? Maybe it would have, I replied, my voice barely containing the anger I'd held in for so long. If you'd come to me before this, if you'd told me you were unhappy, if you'd even given me a chance to try to fix things. But you didn't. You just went off and did whatever you wanted. And now you want me to pick up the pieces? She looked down, wringing her hands. I know I should have talked to you. I felt so alone, Greg. I felt like we drifted apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. But I see now that I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I shook my head, feeling a hollow sadness settle over me. A mistake? I echoed. No, Laura, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to go behind my back. You chose to betray me. And now you want to rewrite history and pretend like it never happened. She reached out, as if to touch my arm, but I pulled away. Please, Greg, she whispered, her voice breaking. Can't we at least try counseling? Or just give me a chance to make it up to you. I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the empty house. Counseling? You think that's going to change anything? You think I can just sit there and pretend that what you did didn't happen? That I can look you in the eye, knowing everything I know? She looked away, tears pooling in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. I think you should go, Laura, I said finally, my voice hard. There's nothing left to say. She stared at me, the realization of finality settling on her face. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but then she nodded, defeated. She picked up the bouquet, looking down at it as if it had failed her, and walked toward the door. I'm sorry, Greg, she whispered, glancing back at me one last time. For everything. I didn't respond, and after a moment, she turned and left, closing the door quietly behind her. I stood there in the silence, the weight of the final goodbye pressing down on me. She tried to reconcile, to patch things up, but it was too little, too late. Whatever we'd once had was gone, and there was no salvaging it. The next day, I called my lawyer again, this time to start the divorce proceedings. I wanted a clean break, a way to move forward without her shadow lingering over my life. There would be paperwork, long hours in mediation, decisions about the house, the finances, and everything we'd once shared, but I was ready. I needed to be free of her, free of the lies and the betrayal, and free to start rebuilding my life. In the days that followed, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't happiness, not by a long shot, but it was something close to acceptance. I didn't need her letters, her flowers, or her desperate attempts to apologize. I didn't need her at all. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see a path forward, even if it was still hazy, even if it would take time. What Laura hadn't realized was that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. And love, real love, requires respect, honesty, and loyalty, 3 things she discarded like they were nothing. Now, as I stood in the empty house, I realized that she'd never fully appreciated those things, but I did. And I knew that somewhere down the line, I'd find a way to build a life I could be proud of, without her in it. Starting the divorce process brought a surprising sense of relief. It felt like a weight had been lifted, as if I was finally taking control after months of feeling lost. I met with my lawyer regularly, going through our shared assets, figuring out the best way to separate everything we'd built over the years. It was exhausting and surreal, having to dismantle a life I'd worked so hard to create. But I knew it was the only way forward. In the beginning, Laura didn't take it seriously. She thought I was bluffing, that I was filing just to scare her. At first, she barely responded to the paperwork my lawyer sent over. I'd hear from mutual friends that she was telling people it was just a rough patch, that I'd come around eventually, that I was too proud to admit I still loved her. But she was wrong. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear to me that there was no going back. My anger had burned out. leaving behind a cold certainty that life with her was over. And so I pressed on with the proceedings, refusing to let her dismiss what she'd done or act like she could sweep her betrayal under the rug. One day, a few weeks into the process, Laura called me out of the blue. She sounded desperate, her voice trembling as she asked to meet in person. "Please, Greg," she said, her voice breaking. "Can we just talk? Just one last time?" I was reluctant to see her. I'd started feeling peace in the distance we'd created, and I didn't want to be dragged back into her drama. But part of me was curious. What could she possibly have to say now? So, I agreed, with the condition that we meet in a public place, a coffee shop we used to visit in the early days of our marriage. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, nervously stirring a cup of tea. She looked up when I walked in, a sad smile crossing her face as she waved me over. I took a seat across from her, keeping my expression neutral. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked like she wanted to reach out, but something in my face must have stopped her. Instead, she just sighed and looked down at her cup. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said quietly. "I know I don't deserve it." I didn't respond, just watched her waiting. She took a deep breath and started to speak. "I know I can't change what I did, Greg," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt you, and I know I betrayed you. I've thought about it every day since you found out. I've been so ashamed." I raised an eyebrow, the anger still simmering below the surface. "You're ashamed? Funny, you didn't look ashamed the night I confronted you in front of our family and friends." She winced, guilt flickering across her face. "I was angry. I was defensive. I don't know what I thought. I just wanted you to forgive me, to let it go. I was selfish, Greg. I see that now." Her words were the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her, but they felt hollow. She continued, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. "I've been talking to a therapist," she said, glancing up at me with a hopeful look. "She's helped me realize how I pushed you away, how I let my own insecurities destroy what we had. I don't know why I did it, but I do know that I'll regret it for the rest of my life." She paused, as if expecting me to say something, but I just sat there silent, letting her speak. "I want you to know that I'm willing to make things right, Greg. I'm willing to give you everything you want in the divorce. The house, the savings, all of it. I don't care about any of that. I just want a chance to make amends, even if it's just as friends." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something, sympathy, maybe, or pity. But then I remembered all the nights I'd spent wondering where she was, all the lies she'd told, all the cold, calculated ways she'd hidden her affair. She'd only cared when she was forced to face the consequences, and now she was just trying to salvage what was left. "No, Laura," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "There's no going back, not even to friendship. You shattered any chance of that the moment you betrayed me." She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop her. "You wanted excitement? You wanted something I couldn't give you? Well, you got it, and now you have to live with it." Her face crumpled, and I could see the fight drain out of her. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely a whisper. I never thought you'd actually go through with this. I thought you'd forgive me eventually." "You thought wrong," I replied, the finality in my tone unmistakable. "This isn't a game, Laura. You don't get to play with people's lives and expect them to stick around when it's convenient for you." The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. Laura looked around the cafe, as if hoping someone would come over and break the tension. But it was just us, just the remnants of a life that had once been full of love and laughter, now reduced to ashes. After a long pause, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something that might have been genuine regret. "Is there really nothing I can do? No way to change your mind?" "No," I said simply, the weight of the words settling between us. "You made your choice, Laura, and now I'm making mine." For the first time, she seemed to truly understand. She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry, Greg," she whispered, the words sounding hollow. "I'm so sorry." I nodded, feeling an odd sense of closure. "I know, but it doesn't change anything. We sat in silence for a few moments longer before she finally stood up, gathering her things. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with the sadness of someone who'd lost everything. But I didn't feel pity, and I didn't feel anger. I just felt done. "Goodbye, Laura," I said, watching as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the crowd outside. As I watched her go, I felt the last remnants of our relationship slip away, leaving behind a strange, empty calm. I knew I'd made the right decision, even if it had taken me longer than I'd like to admit. The years we'd spent together, the life we'd built, it was all over now, but for the first time I felt free. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I wouldn't let her betrayal define me. With the divorce set in motion, I spent the next few months quietly separating our lives. Laura signed the papers without a fight, sticking to her promise to give me what I wanted. She moved out of town shortly afterward, and from what I heard through mutual friends, she kept to herself, her social circle shrinking as word spread about the affair. It was a long process, untangling the years we'd spent together, but with every box I packed, every memory I let go, I felt a little bit lighter. There was no joy in it, no victory, just a quiet sense of acceptance. I'd lost a part of myself in this process, but I'd also gained something, a clarity, a strength I didn't know I had. Eventually, the paperwork was finalized, and the house was mine. I redecorated, moved things around, and slowly began to make the place my own. It felt strange at first, living in a home that had once been filled with memories, but with each passing day, it felt a little more like mine. I started to reconnect with old friends, taking up hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. I spent more time outdoors, hiking, fishing, doing the things I'd always loved but had let slip away in the routines of married life. And little by little, I began to find a new rhythm, a new peace in the quiet moments I spent alone. Life didn't become perfect overnight. There were days when I still felt the sting of her betrayal, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. But those moments grew fewer, replaced by the quiet contentment of a man who'd learned to stand on his own 2 feet. Looking back now, I realized that what I'd lost was never truly mine to begin with. Laura had been a part of my life, yes, but she'd never really been my partner. She'd been someone who'd taken advantage of my trust, my loyalty, and my love, and I'd let her. But that part of my life was over, and I was finally free to move forward, unburdened by the past. And as I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Not for what she'd done, but for what I'd learned, for the strength I'd found within myself. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was ready for whatever came next. The divorce papers arrived in the mail a week later, finalized and signed. As I held the envelope in my hands, I felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. Part of me had mourned this loss long before it was official, but now, with the finality of it staring back at me, I felt an undeniable sense of peace. I'd spent years giving everything to a relationship that was built on shaky ground, hoping my loyalty would make it stronger. But now I knew that loyalty alone couldn't save a marriage that lacked honesty and respect. With the house finally mine, I spent the next few months reclaiming it, little by little. I painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and turned the spare room into a study where I could write, read, and reflect in peace. Friends visited more often, filling the house with laughter and warmth that had been missing for years. I began to find a new rhythm in the everyday moments. Morning coffee on the porch, evenings spent reading by the fire, the quiet hum of a life I'd built for myself. Looking back now, I realized that Laura's betrayal, painful as it was, had set me free. It forced me to see myself for who I was, a man who could survive heartbreak, who could rebuild, who deserved more than half-truths and broken promises. I learned to trust myself again, to value my own peace, and to find strength in solitude. As the sun set over the quiet street one evening, I sat on the porch, a calmness settling over me. Life was simpler now, and I could finally see a future that was mine alone. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it fully.